All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am here with Professing Preterist for a discussion on end times theology. This is Preterist versus Futurist discussions, and I am thrilled to have Professing Preterist here with me to begin, hopefully, a series of discussions. Me being a futurist for the most part, Professing Preterist being, believe it or not, a preterist in light of his name, probably no surprise. And we have a lot to talk about. And so that's why I think this is going to be an ongoing series. And I think dialogue is important. It's good that we get ourselves out of our comfort zones or echo chambers and enter the debate dojo, as I like to call it, in order to bounce ideas off of each other. And so we're doing eschatology panel nights. I am going to be implementing these one-on-one conversations. And so for those who love a little eschatology, please reach out to me, Standing for Truth Ministries at gmail.com, and we'll set something up. And so with that, Professing Preterist, we have had discussions in the past. The audience, I am sure, is familiar with you. But this is our first face-to-face interaction. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun. And for the audience sake, why don't you just give yourself a brief introduction into who you are and what your specific position is? Oh, I think you might be...
Sorry, I'm good. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. As far as for who I am, I mean, I'm a man. I'm a Christian, just kind of doing my thing every day. Positionally, I'm a full preterist, so I believe that the entirety of the Bible was fulfilled in AD 70, and the rest of time eternal, as far as what the Bible describes. We are living under a new covenant with God. So God is still sovereign, and we are still he is still constantly involved with us. But as far as the Bible is concerned, it's an eschatological book that has been completed.
Very cool. Okay, well, I appreciate that introduction. You are also going to be joining us for our next panel event. And so for those unfamiliar and for those familiar, I'll give you a reminder. I started a Night of Eschatology panel series, and each event, the goal is to have a good variety of views present. And we had our first one last week. It was excellent. Scott Clem, Sam Frost, Anthony Aquino, Phelan McFallon, and Daniel Aldridge. And we engaged a number of important topics. And so the goal is to put on one of these every month, maybe month and a half. And so our next one next month, Professing Preterist is going to be one of the panelists. And so I'm looking forward to that and looking forward to another edifying discussion. Always an edifying discussion when it comes to end times theology. Okay, well, with that, let's just get right into our first topic of discussion for this show. We've discussed hours and hours worth of Daniel 9, Daniel's 70 weeks. I'm sure we'll get back into that. But why don't we start off with something very interesting, I think, especially for the audience. The question of Babylon. Who is end times Babylon? Now, you just conveyed the fact that you're a full preterist. And so you would argue, excuse me, you would argue that end times Babylon was Jerusalem back in 70 AD, where everything essentially, the end of the age, came to an end. And so my specific position for anybody, just a reminder, I'm a premillennial, post-trib, pre-wrath. I do strongly believe in what's called dual prophecy fulfillment. And so rather than taking a strict futurist view on a lot of these passages, as you know, let's say in Daniel 8 or Daniel 11, I would agree with a lot of preterists that those chapters have everything to do with Antiochus Epiphanes in 2nd century BC. But at the same time, it is a shadow of things to come. And so, yes, those events were fulfilled in the past, but since the world works in cycles, God works in prophetic cycles, and the world essentially just works in patterns, right? There's nothing new under the sun. And so I would argue it is going to be fulfilled again. And I justify that through analogs. We find a prophecy in the Old Testament, but we see an analog in the New Testament. That is what gives me justification for making a dual application. And so rather than being a strict futurist and saying, nope, all of this is in the future, or being a strict preterist and saying, nope, all of this is in the past, I argue, yeah, this happened and it's going to happen again. It happened on a local scale, but it's also going to happen again, except this time on a global scale, in the sense that it'll have global ramifications. We had an appetizer, and then we're going to have the main course. And so here specifically in the book of Revelation and the topic of end times Babylon, before I give a couple reasons why I believe Jerusalem cannot be end times Babylon, Professing Preterist, why don't you provide a few reasons as to why you believe it is Jerusalem, and also why that supports your specific position of full preterism?
Ooh, a few reasons. That's hard hard to narrow that down. No,
Fine,
but
give me 20 reasons. No, I'm just kidding. We'll
yeah,
start
I
with a
know.
few. We can start with one at a time, or just have some fun. Give us things to work with. Maybe start with a few.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when it comes to this Babylon, um, I guess like the main thing that I would look at would be to recognize what the inspired author John is conveying, right? So Babylon was very important for Israel's like cultural identity in about 700 BC, because Babylon was the kingdom, the nation that came in and sieged Jerusalem the first time. Now this is talking in regards to like Israel was promised this land, okay? When they were in the wilderness in Sinai, God made very specific promises to them, and he fulfilled those promises. Joshua 23 kind of confirms that. Babylon was the first nation to come in and actually encroach on Jerusalem, which was the capital for all intents and purposes of Israel at that time. It was where God had set up his dwelling place. There was a tabernacle in the wilderness that they carried, and they rested the Ark of the Covenant there in Jerusalem. This was where God's presence was. Ezekiel, the first half of Ezekiel, is all about God's presence leaving the temple, and that was a contemporary judgment upon Israel for the things that they were doing. That judgment was enacted by Babylon. Yes, you had Assyria that came in with the 10 northern tribes as a way for God to kind of show how all things point to Christ, I would say, and how the Levitical priesthood, the Benjaminites, and the tribe of Judah specifically were a main focus for him. I believe that's God's way of pointing to Paul, who says he was a Benjaminite, who was the minister for the Gentiles, and then you have the Levitical priesthood, which was rendered ineffective at AD 70, and then you have Judah, which is the tribe that Christ came from. It's three very tight knit, very important tribes or bloodlines, I guess you could say, that had judgment enacted upon them by Babylon and by Edom as well. So that's like my main position that I would kind of take to look at is, okay, if we know that the first destruction of the temple was at the hands of Babylon, and Babylon signified an exodus for the southern tribes at the very least. Um, and then those southern tribes come back into the land. They continue to have the doctrines of men that are polluting the holy priesthood, the holy like hierarchy that God ordained to Israel, it makes a lot of sense that he would call this same old covenantal system of worship that he knew was going to be utterly corrupt and utterly wicked, Babylon. Because he's pretty much saying, hey, this is now that fulfillment of, you were under the captivity of Babylon, now you are Babylon, and the judgment is being brought upon you.
Okay, I appreciate that, Professing Preterist. That is most certainly helpful. When I see Babylon in the scriptures, especially in Revelation, I see Babylon as representing global government, or a global system that's essentially united, right? Like at the Tower of Babel, the people were commanded after the flood to be fruitful and multiply, but spread out into all parts of the globe. They didn't do that. And as a result, God had to confuse the languages and essentially force them to spread out. Babylon, at the time that it existed, was a global power, a global empire. And Egypt, same thing, right? We've got, in the Bible, at least, we know there's Egypt, Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, incredibly powerful. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Grecia. Grecia, as you know and would agree, was broken up into 4 kingdoms. Once Alexander the Great died, he died prematurely, and there was no immediate successor. And so you had the Ptolemaic Empire, you had the Seleucid Kingdom, where Antiochus Epiphanes, who I would argue is a little horn of Daniel 8, came out of. But then you also have Rome. That was the global power or empire at Christ's first coming. But the question is, who is Babylon in the book of Revelation? Because I would argue that the spirit of Babylon that represents global government, that represents that global empire of its day, it's my position that that spirit has moved geographically. Once Babylon fell, it resided in Medo-Persia. Once Medo-Persia fell, it resided in Grecia. At the time of Christ, I believe it resided in Rome. It talks about the church in Babylon, and I believe that that's speaking of Rome. And so the question is, when we read about Babylon, Mystery Babylon, in the book of Revelation, the question is, who is Mystery Babylon? And I understand, according to the full preterist position, you'd in many ways have to be forced or compelled to interpret Mystery Babylon as being Jerusalem, as you have everything over in 70 AD. You have the resurrection, the second coming, judgment, so on and so forth, including judgment of Babylon. And so I've got a number of reasons why I believe Jerusalem cannot be Mystery Babylon. And I would contend that these are preclusionary data points. What that means is these are scriptural-based arguments that make it impossible. It precludes Jerusalem from being Babylon. And so I'd be curious as to how you engage them. And we'll just start with point 1, Revelation 11:8. And their bodies, talking about the 2 witnesses, shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom in Egypt, where also our Lord was what? Crucified. And so I think we'd all agree that this is Jerusalem, obviously. So in this instance, in this context, that great city is Jerusalem. But if end times Babylon, the Babylon that we read about in Revelation 18 specifically, but the Babylon that we read about in Jeremiah 50 and 51, which in its immediate context is talking about when Babylon at that time was destroyed. But there's certain parts of the description there that don't necessarily fit with that initial destruction of Babylon. And so I would argue there's a dual fulfillment in the future, and we see the analog Revelation 18 with Babylon. So there's aspects of Jeremiah 50 and 51 that I believe applies to that day, but then also in the future. Okay. And so here in Revelation 11:8, I find it curious that if end times mystery Babylon was truly Jerusalem, this would have been the perfect time for God to say, that great city, which is spiritually Sodom and Egypt, right? Because from this vantage point, people see Jerusalem as a great city. People see Jerusalem as a holy city. But ontologically, or how does God see it positionally? Well, it's a very unholy city. Spiritually, it's Sodom and Gomorrah. National Israel rejected Messiah, and they were judged in 70 AD. And they were judged through the Roman Empire, specifically Commander Titus and his Roman army. And so this would have been the perfect time for God to say, which is spiritually Babylon. But he said, which is spiritually Sodom and Egypt, which tells me that Jerusalem has its own part to play in the end times. God sees it spiritually as Sodom and Egypt, so he sees it as a wicked place. And Babylon has its own part to play in the end time. So I guess my question is, and take your time to respond, how do you view Revelation 11:8 and the fact that Jerusalem is being called spiritually Sodom and Egypt rather than Babylon itself? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I believe that Revelation is a recapitulation story. It recapitulates at least 3 times. I mean, there's motifs that are touched on, which is interesting because I also believe Daniel recapitulates 3 times
Right.
as well when we're looking at like eschatological events. So I think the reason why God chose to identify Old Covenantal Israel, by the way, Old Covenantal Jerusalem. I do believe it's important to specify it's not just Jerusalem in general. We're speaking of the Old Covenantal Jerusalem. You know, they were following the law that was laid down in Sinai. Um, he chooses to identify them as Sodom and Egypt in chapter 11 because Sodom and Egypt were types and shadows pointing towards what Old Covenantal Israel was going to become. Uh, Point being, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 20, it says, "Yet the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance as you are today." So God uses specific language to call Egypt an iron furnace. Okay. He also goes on to say that they were under the bondage of slavery in Egypt. This is because they were not in their holy land, the land that God had predestined from before time eternal for Israel to be in. They weren't in there, but they were multiplying. It's almost like pointing towards the way that the church or the ecclesia is identified as growing, right, in like all throughout like Colossians and stuff, throughout the New Testament. Paul draws a lot of imagery to, hey, like Christ is the head, we are the body, and there's ligaments and there's all these things that are growing. Israel was in a gestation phase in Egypt. They were there. There. I mean, we could talk all about what happened with Joseph and his brothers and all that, but when we look at the important part of it, it was time for Israel for the birth to happen. Israel got exodized out of Egypt. They wandered the desert for 40 years, and then they came into the promised land and conquered all these armies as was promised by God to enter their promised land. So Egypt is very representative of the bondage they were under while they were waiting to be birthed. And this is what Old Covenantal Israel represents. When Christ died at the cross, I think we talked about this last time. I believe Christ died at the cross in 30 AD.
Right.
And this was when he died, there was a lot of things that happened, right, at his death, burial, and resurrection. But one of the main motifs that I would say is Israel began their final exodus, their final 40 years, just like they wandered the wilderness. Christ even is symbolic of like a type of birthing process. When he gets pierced with the spear, blood and water come out of his lungs, right? That's indicative of heart failure, for one, when water comes out of your, it starts filling up your body.
Right.
But for number two, that water represents birth. And so he's signifying like, okay, we're entering the final phase. Okay, Israel, your gestation period is about to kick in, just like it did in the wilderness for 40 years when you left Egypt. So, and as far as for Sodom, it's because Sodom was utterly corrupt.
Right.
God makes it's a very interesting back and forth he has with Abraham. Abraham was a very pure man, pure of heart. He goes, God, what if you find 5 people that are good? And he goes, yeah, if we find 5 people, by all means, I will save those people, right? But God obviously knew it wasn't going to happen. They were an utterly corrupt society, and they physically got completely destroyed with physical fire and
Fire
brimstone.
and brimstone.
Right. So these are physicalities that God used to prove his omnipresence, his dominance, however you want to describe it, because there's no doubt that these people in Sodom were pagans. They
Right.
weren't following God. They had other gods, and all throughout the book of
Well, the
Ezekiel.
city, basically Sodom nationally
Mhm.
was in many ways turned over to a reprobate mind.
Yes,
They were
exactly.
beyond the hope of salvation at that point. Like you said, if I can
Yeah,
find, just 2
yeah,
righteous people, 5 righteous people, 10 righteous people, but as a
yes.
whole, the nation itself was wicked and reprobate.
Yes, and this is there's a bit of like a almost ethical question that comes into that. People will ask, well, how many babies were in Sodom when God
Mm,
destroyed it? And it's
yeah.
like, well, but that's the point. God makes a very clear point that like if there is an utterly corrupt society, those children had no chance. They weren't going to know God. You know what I mean? So it's actually best that he did that while those children were still too young to know the difference between good and evil,
Well,
right?
if I could, those are
Yeah.
some good points, and I think basically I agree with everything you're saying for the most part. It was Jesus. I think it was Matthew 18 when he was talking to the centurion. You hast believed. He was marveled at the
Hmm.
centurion's great faith,
Yeah.
but he
Greatest faith
looked
that he found
to
in Judea.
right, and he said, referring to the children of the kingdom, you're going to be cast out in outer darkness. There's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so Jesus marveled at the fact that he came unto his own, but his own received him not. And so national Israel should have repented. They should have accepted the Messiah. And because they rejected Messiah as a
Okay.
whole, of course, there's a remnant, and there's always 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal in any nation
Yeah.
that has essentially turned from the Lord and turned from Christianity today. And so they experienced judgment. Jerusalem was judged in 70 AD, the Jewish Roman War, 7 years, 67 to 73 AD. And in 70 AD, specifically, Titus came in with the Roman legion, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple. So they were judged. And according to my specific view, the futurist view, and I can demonstrate this, and we can certainly discuss it through the book of Revelation, the Antichrist will come to power largely because of national Israel and them helping him come to power, and he will eventually double cross them, and there will be another judgment. Matthew 24, Luke 20, Mark 13, those events largely describing what happened in 70 AD. And it's amazing because the warning Jesus gave about, when you see the Roman armies encompassing Jerusalem, when you see these things begin to come to pass, flee for the mountains, right? Talking to the Christians. Because as you go through these chapters, you've got your second and third person plural pronouns, they, them. As your third person, wrath is upon this people, speaking of national Israel. And then when it comes to ye, your, he's speaking to his disciples, right? And history tells it that that's what happened. A lot of your Christians actually survived because they took the warnings of Jesus seriously. But then we have an analog in the book of Revelation where, again, the world works in cycles. The world works in very specific patterns. There's going to be another similar situation where national Israel again is judged. They help the Antichrist get into power. They help him set up his one world government, one world religion, one world currency, the image of the beast. And they've still rejected Messiah. And so they're judged again. Wrath is upon this third person plural pronoun, this people. Zechariah 14 says, God, he says, I will bring the nations against Jerusalem to battle. I will bring the nations against Jerusalem to battle. So it's God bringing the nations in to judge Jerusalem. And so why I'm saying all this is because, yeah, it makes sense that Jerusalem is being called spiritually Sodom and Egypt. Sodom was a wicked place. Sodom was burned and judged with fire and brimstone. Egypt was a wicked place. And there's a lot of symbolism as well in terms of what you were talking about. But the fact that Jerusalem is not referred to as spiritually Babylon gives me a hermeneutical reason to interpret Babylon as being another city or another empire. And so this would be my follow-up to you, is Revelation 16, 19 to 21 specifically. And so feel free to speak to this, because I did appreciate the points you just made. And 19 starts with, and the great city. So here in the context of Revelation 16, Jerusalem being referred to as a great city, I would argue that New York City is a great city. I would argue that Seattle's a great city. I would argue that Toronto's a great city, right? There's a lot of great cities out there. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're always Jerusalem in this case. And the great city was divided into three parts due to, if I'm not mistaken, the context is an earthquake. Jerusalem's divided into three parts. So there's three different judgments taking place here in Revelation 16. So we have Jerusalem divided into three parts. The ripple effect of that is the cities of the nations. Now they fall, right? So number one, Jerusalem divided into three parts. Number two, the cities of the nations fell. And then number three, Great Babylon came in remembrance before God. So now God is remembering Great Babylon, Mystery Babylon, that wicked city, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found, so on and so forth. And so my argument here is, if we read this text plainly, it demonstrates that Babylon has not yet received what is coming to them, because it is not item one on the agenda. It's actually item three. Item one is what? An earthquake on Jerusalem. Item two, the ripple effect of the earthquake onto the other cities. And then item three, culminating with wrath upon what? Great Babylon, Mystery Babylon. And so the last point I'll make, and then take your time, is this means Great Babylon cannot, hermeneutically, be the same city as the city spoken of at the beginning of the verse, the great city, which is Jerusalem. And I would interpret scripture with scripture and go back to Revelation 11 that we were talking about, where God has already made it clear that Jerusalem, in this instance, is spiritually Sodom and Egypt, for the many reasons that we've discussed so far, but not spiritually Babylon. What are your thoughts on this overall?
Well, so overall, I would say that if you're going to agree that Revelation 11 is Jerusalem, it poses a pretty big problem, because in Revelation 11, this is like signifying the seventh trumpet. So, like I said, I believe that Revelation is a recapitulation. I think it recapitulates quite a few times, but the main motifs that we find are the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven bowls of wrath, right?
Right.
These are all the same event, just told from a little bit different of a perspective with intensifying.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you,
Yeah.
but I would say just real quickly,
Yeah.
I do believe that we see recapitulation.
Yeah.
I just want the audience to understand my specific position,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I think what you just said, I would differ in the sense that, so on the screen, and also if you ever want to show visuals or slides, you just let me know and I'll put it up for you.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
here in the book Revelation, I do believe it's very similar to what we find in Daniel, where you can literally just split the book right down the middle. split it in half. You've got chapters 1 to 11, right? Chapter 11 ends with the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord Jesus Christ. So from my understanding, from my position, that's the millennium. Once we go into Revelation 12, we're back in 1st century AD. The question is, why are we back in 1st century AD with the birth of Christ? Well, if you go to chapter 1, we're in 1st century AD with John on the Isle of Patmos. 2 and 3, we have the 7 churches, the letter sent out to the 7 churches. Revelation 4, John is taken up in spirit to see things before the throne of God, to see things that are to come, right? The future. And then Revelation 6, we have the seals, world at war, famine, starvation, death in 1/4 of the earth, so on and so forth. And then from my position, I believe in a 6 seal rapture. And so sun and moon go dark at the end of Revelation 6. And then God says, the great day of his wrath is come, present tense. So I would argue, here's God's wrath. We have the great multitude that appear in heaven in Revelation 7. And then the start of God's wrath with the trumpets, 8, 9, 10, and 11. 11 ending with the millennial reign. And then we have a recapitulation in the sense that it's the same events now, but told, more details are provided. So Revelation 13, tribulation, but more specifically, rather than going through the seals, God tells us, okay, we got the beast, we got the image of the beast, we got the mark of the beast, we got the false prophet, right? All of this happening during the tribulation. And then God's wrath again. Actually, the rapture, Jesus Christ comes on a white cloud to reap the harvest of the earth. He's got a sickle. And that lines up perfectly with Revelation 7, where the great multitude appear in heaven. Then we have 15, 16, the vials. Babylon's mentioned in 17, and then the fall of Babylon in 18, Armageddon 19, and then eventually new heaven and new earth. So I do agree with you to an extent,
right?
But I don't see your vials, trumpets, and seals all happening at the same time. I see your seals. Then I see, once your seals are done, the 7th seal, God's wrath, starts. Then we have trumpets and vials occurring concurrently. Trumpet, vial, trumpet, vial, trumpet, vial, because that's God's wrath, supernatural judgments, basically. So I just wanted to clarify that. Feel free to speak to that, but I know you had a few points to make based on Revelation 16, I think is what we were on. So go ahead.
Yeah,
take your time.
It's all good. So part of Revelation 11, though, is that in verse 18, it says, the nations were enraged and your wrath has come. The time has come to judge the dead and to reward your servants, the prophets, as well as the saints and those who fear your name, both small and great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. So if we're taking Revelation 11 to be Jerusalem, and it's the 7th trumpet, the time of the 7th trumpet would be the time when the wrath has come, and that'd be the time when it'd be to judge the dead, but you can't judge the dead unless they're resurrected. So this has to be the resurrection. And then also at that time, there'd be the rewarding of the servants and prophets. So that would be the inheritance that the people would be given, which would also include the people who are alive being changed in the blink of an eye. Because this is covenantal language. So I would say that, there's a lot to be said if you think that old covenantal Jerusalem is Revelation 11. You now have to try and kind of conciliate. Okay, so what's the 7th trumpet then? Like, how far in the future do you extend that from Revelation?
Which verse exact? I've got it up right here. Just to
18.
follow. Okay, so 18. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come. Yeah, because we're in the trumpets.
Mm-hmm.
And the time of the dead that they so for my specific model, post-trib pre-wrath, since Revelation 12 restarts the chronology and Revelation 11 ends with the millennial reign, this fits perfectly, because I would argue that you got the judgment seat of Christ, which is for believers, and it's for reward. Then you've got the great white throne judgment, which is for unbelievers, and they'll be judged according to their works. But we understand, he that maketh a lie, one lie, and you are on your way to the lake of fire. And so none of them are going to pass judgment because they don't have the imputed righteousness of Christ. And so unbelievers will fail at the great white throne judgment. The judgment seat of Christ, though, for believers, for reward or loss of reward, in my view, happens right before the millennium, because that reward is largely for the millennium. And so this makes sense that in 18, and the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants. Right? So we have the servants, which are the believers, the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the city. And so we would have, and what's interesting is your second part chronology also ends with the same thing. There were lightnings and voices and thunderings. You're basically your seventh trumpet, thunderings and hail. Your seventh vial is poured into the air, and then we have thunderings and hail. So that's that two-part chronology that I'm talking about. And so, yeah, I don't see why this would be an issue, because Jerusalem is laid desolate at the midpoint of the week. And whether you believe in a future Daniel 70th week or not, what I mean by that is Antichrist continues in power for 42 months, and then Jerusalem is trodden down of the Gentiles. I think it's right in here, trodden down of the Gentiles for 42 months, right here. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. So to me, this is the time of the Gentiles. This is when the times of the Gentiles starts. And the holy city, Jerusalem, from this vantage point, shall they tread underfoot 40 and 2 months. And so basically, you have the Antichrist claiming to be God in the middle of the week. He's now going to continue for another 3.5 years. And this is basically where his armies come in, take over Jerusalem. Jerusalem is judged again. And your hub, your center for the future one world government is in Jerusalem, as in Antichrist is ruling from Jerusalem, which is another interesting point against the Jerusalem is Babylon theory. Why in the world would because we know that God puts into the hearts of the 10 kings, but they're all one mind with the Antichrist. They give their power to the Antichrist. And the Bible, I think it's in Revelation 17, we can look at it, talks about how he puts it in their hearts to judge Babylon in 1 hour. And then what's interesting in Jeremiah 51, what does it say here? Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up against Babylon. Remember, we have an immediate fulfillment, but a future one, I would argue. And against them that dwell in the midst of them that rise up against thee, a destroying wind. Well, anybody that understands nuclear warfare, nuclear bomb, I mean, I'm sure we've all seen that black and white video where the nuclear bomb goes off and it's a destroying wind. Or you see it in Terminator 2, Judgment Night, where basically the nuclear bomb goes off and then there's this destroying wind that just turns everybody into instant skeletons. Like, that's pretty scary. And so I see Babylon being judged by the Antichrist and his armies. It talks about Babylon is judged in 1 hour. And if we interpret scripture with scripture, it's with a destroying wind, it's with fire. And so I interpret that as being nuclear warfare. I think that's exactly what's being described here. So why in the world would Antichrist nuke or attack himself? Because if Jerusalem is Babylon, wait a minute, he's in Jerusalem. His army's coming in. It says it right here, the holy city they shall tread upon 40 and 2 months. And so this is where the Antichrist is ruling and reigning basically for this 42-month period. Why in the world is he destroying himself? It makes sense that he's destroying another city. And I said a lot there, but you made some good points on Revelation 11. And so I'm just saying, from my specific model, my eschatological model, I don't see it as a problem. It could be a problem to maybe somebody who's more dispensationalist and pre-trib, because they interpret the vials, seals, and trumpets a little differently. But anyways, everything I just said, speak to it. Take your time.
Yeah, I'd like to actually share my screen if I could. I'm gonna do the request here and just let me know when it's popped up.
You're good.
All right, so is this big enough? Like, is it able to be read?
Yeah, I put it full screen so we can read it a little easier.
Yeah, so I want to go to Old Testament, okay, and then we're going to look at Revelation. So Exodus 19, verses 16 through 19 says, on the third day when morning came, there was thunder and lightning. A thick cloud was upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the ram's horn went out, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire, and the smoke rose like the smoke of a furnace. Again, we have that kind of furnace imagery. And the whole mountain quaked violently. As the sound of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the thunder. So we have thunder and lightning, fire, earthquakes, peals of murmurings of people, right? And when we look at Revelation 8, verse 5, it is literally directly drawing from what happens when God comes to the earth. The angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it to the earth. And there were peals of thunder and rumblings and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. This is your first capitulation, right? So this is like John saying, okay, this is the first time. But notice how it gets more intense, because in Revelation 11:19, then the temple of God in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple, and there were flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder and an earthquake. And now we have a great hailstorm, which, historically speaking, this would be justified by the way that Rome attacked and assaulted Jerusalem with catapults, with giant pieces of stone that were raining down on the city. And then you have your final capitulation of it, which is Revelation 16, 18, and 19, where there are flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, the likes of which had not occurred since men were upon the earth. So mighty was this great quake. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. And God remembered Babylon and gave her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. This is talking like about the same thing, but you notice that this imagery is what happened in Exodus when God was literally descended upon the earth. So you have the physical, right?
But these are supernatural plagues, right? When God literally descended on the earth in Exodus.
Well, it was things that actually physically happened, right? So whenever we're reading scripture, Moses in Exodus 19 is giving an account of what happened. He wasn't prophesying. He was just giving an account of, like, dude, this is what happened. This is how it went down. This is what it looked like. But Revelation is different because it's a prophecy. So what it's doing is it's drawing from the physicality of Exodus, right? And it's using this poetic language to draw on a not actual, like, it's not literally being literal when it's talking about, like, the great earthquake, like, that had not occurred since men were upon the earth. It's using that same imagery, though, of, hey, when God comes and visits the earth, right, there's a great earthquake. He's pretty much expounding upon the fact that in Revelation
I would
6,
argue that there will be a great earthquake, and that's exactly why in Revelation 16 that great city, which is Jerusalem, is divided up into 3. This is judgment. This is why your trumpet judgments, trumpet 1 starts with what? Hail and fire being cast upon the earth. But the angels, what do they say? They say, hurt not the earth, hurt not the grass, hurt not the sea, until the servants of our God, the 144,000, are sealed in their foreheads. And so the point is, this is going to be a literal judgment. Like the earth, the sea, and the trees, the grass, they will be burnt up. They will be hurt. It's not like this isn't really happening. This is all just symbolic language, because that wouldn't make sense, since the angel is basically saying, no, don't pour out your wrath yet. Don't sound the first trumpet, because we need the servants of our God healed before you hurt literally the sea, the grass,
right? Okay.
the trees, the earth. And so I would see this very similar to the plagues of Egypt, where those were supernatural plagues, right? This is God literally judging the earth in a similar way that he judged Exodus. Because I'm assuming you look to the plagues of Exodus as being literal supernatural judgments. Okay. And that's how I see your trumpets and your vials as well. I see them as being literal hail and fire. literal locusts coming out of the bottomless pit, literal thunderings, hail, just massive hail just falling down onto the earth where nobody can basically escape it. Do you see these judgments as being literal, or are you saying they're very much symbolic?
Yeah, no, I think that they are very much symbolic, but I'm also not saying that there wasn't literal ramifications of the things that were happening at that time in AD 70. So like, um, there's there's not a whole lot of like really scholarly information on the Roman Jewish War. You're really limited to just a few authors, but um, there are quite a few sources that would state that at the time of the beginning of these revolts that were popping up throughout the entire Roman Empire, there were like really bad plagues going around. There was people that were like real sick, and a lot of people were dying. There's a lot of starvation and famine. So like we can take this
But wouldn't
actualization.
those fall in line with what we read with the seals? Because remember, I would agree with you that Matthew 24, Luke 20, and Mark 13, in many ways, were describing events associated with that 7-year Jewish-Roman war. And so Matthew 24 specifically talks about Antichrist and false prophets, talks about the world at war, right? Wars and rumors of war, talks about famine, starvation, inflation. And so, yeah, those are the natural result or ripple effect of war. The ripple effect of war, I mean, look at World War II, look at World War I, it's always inflation, starvation, famine, death.
Right.
And I think it was the Spanish flu that was it World War I with the Spanish flu that was, or was that World War II? Regardless, we've had, no, it would have been, I think, World War I. And so what you're describing to me, yeah, that sounds legit, because with that 7-year war, that's what you're going to have. Then I would look to Revelation 6 as being your analog, where in the end times, you're going to have these same events taking place, but this time they're going to be global in scale rather than an appetizer where it's just isolated to the Middle East, to Jerusalem with the 7-year war. Because outside of Jerusalem, outside of the Middle East, it was really just a big nothing burger. Like, most people probably didn't even hear about it. To the people in Jerusalem, obviously it was a big deal.
Right.
But when we extrapolate your localized fulfillment to the end times grand fulfillment, then it's world war. It's worldwide famine, worldwide starvation, worldwide death. But the point I'm trying to make is, once we get into your trumpets and vials, that's where we see hail and fire. That's where we see massive earthquakes. That's where we see smoke and locusts out of the bottomless pit. Do we have historical documentation of those types of plagues happening?
So yeah, that's where I would say that this is like apocalyptic imagery, what it's talking about here. So,
But I mean,
like,
the Exodus account with the plagues, those weren't just apocalyptic literature imagery. I mean, that literally happened. You'd agree, right?
yes, correct. So that's why when I believe that, like, when we're looking at what Moses was accounting through the what they call it, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. I believe that, like, Moses is literally giving an account of what happened. I don't think that Moses necessarily was actively writing down while he was prophesying. Does that kind of make sense? Like, I think that this was something that, like, when Moses was at the end of his life, God was like, okay, now is the time to give the account of what, from Genesis to Numbers, I guess, would be
What
what we're
happened?
looking at. Correct, what happened. So this is an account where you're like, okay, there are types and shadows that point to Christ. I believe that the entirety of the Old Testament points to Christ. But I believe that, yes, like, the majority of things talked about are physicality, like, absolutely 100%.
Physical, literal physical.
Yes, but when we get to prophets, right? Like people that are actively prophesying in the Old Testament, they use very prophetic language to describe very real events. So, like, you're having to almost transpose, like, okay, what does, like, the sun and the stars and the moon really represent? Does it physically mean the moon, sun, and stars? Or is God using language to talk about governing bodies of people, and the stars are like the people underneath those governments, right? Because like
Well, let me say that because I partially agree with you there,
Mhm.
that in the Old Testament, you have a lot of,
Right.
so for example, you have many days of the Lord.
Mm.
And when these events would happen, when there is a power shift or a change in geopolitics, let's say from, Egypt to Assyria to Babylon to Medo-Persia, Grecia, they could use that kind of language, sun and moon going dark, as
Mhm.
being symbolic of the fall of one kingdom and the rise of another. But I would argue that they're using that language based on real, literal, physical events that will happen in the future. I mean, God's already been to our funeral. He's outside the time, matter, and space. He's seen the end from the beginning. And so he oftentimes speak about future things as if they are, as if they've already happened, they're
Right.
happening now.
Right.
And so people would use that language about the literal day of the Lord, where the sun and moon go dark, stars fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens are shaken, literal physical events, but utilizing that in a way to describe events in the past, like the fall of a kingdom and the rise of another. Does that make sense? So yeah, at that time, the sun and moon probably didn't go dark, but in the future, they will go dark, and they're using that literal future physical event as a way to symbolize what's going on in terms of kingdom shifts. Does that make sense? Are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I'd be like, okay, so yeah, we're talking about kingdom shifts, the deliverance of the kingdom, which is God's kingdom, which is the new covenant, is using that same that same language. So I agree with you. I think it applies in a not very 100% literal sense to a very 100% literal happening, for sure.
Just one second.
Hey, you're good. So, and I mean, like, what I'd like to do is kind of start, next point being touching on, like Revelation, uh, like 18 to kind of really like go into, okay,
Sure.
like
Well,
the motif. Yeah.
let's do that. But I'd be curious
Hmm.
as to, and I appreciate this conversation and these points that we're engaging.
Yeah.
When we look at, and I mentioned this earlier, right? We're in Revelation 17.
Hmm.
If
Okay.
you go down to verse 17,
Yep.
notice this. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled.
Hmm.
And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So once you get into Revelation 18 with the destruction of Mystery Babylon, we basically have Babylon being destroyed by the 10 kings that have given
Correct.
their power to the Antichrist.
Okay.
And it says, for God hath put it in their hearts to fulfill his will, to destroy Babylon. And so basically, God is destroying Babylon through the Antichrist, through the kings that are one mind with the Antichrist, much like how God oftentimes judges nations all throughout the
Hmm.
Old Testament and throughout history. He doesn't necessarily come down and do the judgment himself. He uses nations. He
Correct.
uses oftentimes wicked nations to carry out his judgment, like the Roman Empire in 70 AD. And so here
Correct.
he's using the beast system to destroy Babylon. But the question is, how are they destroying it? And I would argue, well, it seems pretty clear if it's being destroyed by fire, it's being destroyed in 1 hour. How do you destroy an entire city in 1 hour? Well, I think when you interpret scripture and understand Jeremiah 50:51, he destroys it with a destroying wind. But wait a minute, he's accomplishing his will in terms of the destruction of Babylon. He's doing so through the kings that have one mind with the beast. And I think the best way to understand that or interpret that is we've got nuclear warfare here. In 1 hour, Babylon is destroyed. And again, it brings me back to my question. If it's the Antichrist and these kings and these armies that are destroying Babylon, but he's in Babylon, because remember, for 42 months, this is the times of the Gentiles, as in Jerusalem's going to be trodden down underfoot of the Gentiles for 42 months.
All right.
Why in the world is he destroying where he is? His center of power. Why is he destroying himself? Basically, it doesn't seem to make sense. Go ahead.
Well, so I'll step into your court, and we can kind of take a look at, like, if I were to take the futurist view. I mean, it's not very hard to imagine this Antichrist type character who supposedly has all the influence and all the riches and all this stuff in the world to, like, have a bomb bunker or have a private helicopter that gets him out of the area, and then it's like, cool, drop the bomb. Because if he's the Antichrist, he's the most evil, wicked person ever in history. Well, what does he care if all the people that were following him just got roasted? You don't care. He's just doing what he's supposed to do, as you know what I mean. So I don't really see merit in that. But obviously, from a full preterist point of view, I don't believe the beast is the Antichrist. I don't think there's a singular Antichrist. I think the beast is talking about the governing body of Rome that God was going to use to bring judgment upon Israel. So when we get to the kings, right? So Paul is using old covenantal language. Daniel talks about the same thing about kings, these 10 horns. The 10 horns are the 10 kings.
Well, but I think what you just said is very interesting. I just want to stop you there before I forget. And I think this will be good for the audience too.
Yeah.
Well, therefore, how do you see verse 10 here? And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen.
Yep.
And so John right now is writing this.
Correct.
He's seeing this.
Correct.
At the time, like you just said, where the Roman Empire is ruling the known world. Okay.
Correct.
So there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. Okay. Well, let's just count. What are these kings that also represent kingdoms, right? Like Nebuchadnezzar, but Babylon is represented, but also represented as Nebuchadnezzar, right? The king that represents his kingdom. So we have Egypt, Assyria, there's 2, Babylon, there's 3, Medo-Persia, and Rome.
Okay.
Oh, no. Grecia. So you got Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Grecia. So there's 5. 5 are fallen. 1 is because he's writing this at the time of Rome. Okay. And the other is not yet come. Mm-hmm. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. So I would argue that yes, 1 is, because he's on the Isle of Patmos. He's being seen these visions. He's writing them down. The Roman Empire rules the known world. What's the 1 to come? Well, I would argue that is your future beast system that's spoken of in Revelation 13, where essentially you have a one world currency. All of the kings of the earth give their power to the beast, and you have the false prophet, and you also have this image of the beast, basically, that can talk. And so that would be the future. So my point is, you're saying all of this ended with Rome, but he's saying 1 is, but then there's 1 that still has to come. Well, what's the 1 that has to come, I guess, according to your view?
So when we look at, like, Revelation 17 verses 16 and following, he doesn't necessarily, like, okay, in verse 13, yes, he does call them, he does say, and I just want to make sure I'm looking properly at the interlinear. So look at this, okay? Here's the thing. When we look at these modern translations, if we look at Revelation 17:13 in the original Greek text, it never once says the word kings. It just says these have one mind. And it's obviously hearkening back to the previous verse, right? Where, yes, it does say that they are kings, right? But really it could mean a ruler. So we have to use, like, context. Okay, so in verse 12 and 13 and following, I get 12 and following, it's talking about something. But when we're looking at verse 10, it says there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen. So I'm gonna do a simple thing here. I'm just gonna go to Wikipedia, and we're gonna start with Augustus Caesar. Okay, so you've got Augustus Caesar. That's number 1. His successor was Tiberius. That's number 2. Then you have Augustus, or I'm sorry, Caligula, who was number 3. Then you have Claudius, who is number 4. And then you have Nero, who was number 5, right? So you've got these kings that it says that they and then the one that is, so 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come.
Who would
But
be the
wait,
one that is?
so here's what we're looking at though. We're looking at a timeline that's after Nero. So John is giving a revelation after Nero dies, because it's talking about when the judgment would be coming upon Old Covenantal Israel. So then his successor was Galba, right? So Galba is the one in question, but then his successor was Otho, who was only there for a little time. Then you have Vitellius, who was taken up by Vespasian. So if we're looking at this line of Caesars specifically, so like, okay, I think there was only 5 or a couple Caesars, right? If we're looking at like where this all started, because it started with Augustus Caesar, right? So he's the first one, and then you have Tiberius Caesar, who's the second one. Then Caligula Caesar, then Claudius Caesar, then Nero Caesar. But then after that, you don't have any more Caesars, because it's Galba, who was not identified as a Caesar, Otho, who is not identified as a Caesar, Vitellius, who's not identified as a Caesar, and then Vespasian, who's not identified by a Caesar. So I think that like there is something very specific to be talked about here when we're looking at the timeline of Revelation 17, and it's talking about these 7 kings, the 5 that had fallen, the one that is, and the other that has not yet come, but he only remains for a little while. The beast that was and now is not is an 8th king who belongs to the other 7 and is going into destruction. The 10 horns that you saw. So now he's switching it up, because now he's like, okay, so those are the 7 mountains, right? The 7 heads are the 7 mountains. There's 7 kings. Then there's an 8th one coming. Now let's switch it up and talk about the 10 horns. Those are the 10 kings, right, who have not yet received a kingdom, but will receive 1 hour of authority as kings along with the beast. This is talking about the provinces that Rome controlled at the time of the first Roman Jewish War. So
see, my issue with that is the issue that I have with a lot of historicist interpretations of some of these prophetic passages is, living in 2023, we now have the advantage of hindsight.
right.
And so we can basically cook the books and we can say, well, okay, we got these, 5 Caesars. And then at the time it was Nero. And then you can kind of work your way backwards and make it fit. But what I prefer hermeneutically in this instance is the fact that the Bible itself, firstly in Daniel, tells us that your kings are associated with kingdoms, right? These great
Correct.
beasts. Speaking of Babylon, speaking of Medo-Persia, these are world empires at the time, right? Medo-Persia was your dominating force at that time, Babylon, so on and so forth. And so you have a king per kingdom, but we actually have the Bible that tells us, because we read about Egypt, we read about Assyria, we read about Babylon, we read about Medo-Persia, we read about Rome, okay? And so rather than just isolating it all to Rome and Roman leaders, it makes more sense to take those kingdoms that the Bible talks about, and we see very specifics about them in the book of Daniel, and then understand, okay, these are kings, 2 separate kingdoms. These ones have specifically fallen in the past. Those 5 are mentioned throughout Scripture. So rather than just looking through, interpreting this in hindsight, we actually have the Scriptures telling us, okay, here's your 5 major empires. One is, okay, that's Rome, obviously, John on the Isle of Patmos, writing during the time that Rome was ruling its day, and then one to come. Well, I don't see any real justification to say that the one to come also belongs with the Rome of that day. It makes sense if the ones before were separate, isolated kingdoms, then the one to come should be a separate, isolated kingdom as well. And that kingdom would also have a king, right? It would also have a ruler. Speak to that. Actually, before you speak to that,
so what I want to kind of look at with that is Daniel gives very specific kind of like guidelines, right? There's only 4 kingdoms with Daniel's vision. We have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Grecia, and Rome. Christ walked the earth in the time of the Roman Empire. So we know that we have to limit this to 4 kingdoms for if we're looking at it from Daniel's perspective. Now, when we get to Revelation 16, what I'm seeing is John is magnifying that prophecy. So he's like, okay, John's like, we're living in the time of this 4th kingdom that Daniel's talking about. So let's like hone in and see, like, God is like using John to convey this is what's going to happen in the time of this 4th kingdom. And one thing that I want to kind of point out is, so when we look at verse 12 of Revelation 17, it says, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom,
right,
but will receive 1 hour of authority as kings along with the beast.
Right.
So if I'm a 1st century, citizen of the Roman Empire, I have to try to put myself in their mindset. Okay, if I read that and said, okay, so there's 10 kings, but they haven't received a kingdom, but they get authority as kings. So we have to look at, like, it's not talking about 10 like actual different empires or anything. It's just talking about 10 really important people.
Well, here's how if I can say how I see it real quick before you continue. Just like you see these worldwide meetings with the world leaders, what's it called? The G something
G7,
summit.
Yeah,
G7 summit, where you have all these world leaders come, someone from China, North Korea, America, Russia, India. And so what this looks like, since the description seems to fit a one world power, you have something very similar. You have this big meeting, G7 meeting, and you have all these different kings, okay? And they receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast because they give all of their power. So basically sovereign nations, separate sovereign nations like we have today, right? And they give their sovereignty essentially over to the beast. But as a result, this gives them a degree of power in that one world system. So you basically have this one world system where you have who I would argue is the man of sin, the son of perdition. The Bible says there are many, and antichrist shall come, singular, but in the world there are many antichrists. So many antichrists, you could say Antiochus Epiphanes, Nero, Titus. Okay, we could talk about antichrist over the last couple hundred years, but there'll be one main antichrist. And so it seems to be saying that they're going to give all their power to the beast. And then Revelation 17 concludes, to bring us back to who is Mystery Babylon, with God telling us that he puts in their hearts to fulfill his will. And then it's through them. So it's a physical judgment. It's through them that Babylon is destroyed. It's destroyed in 1 hour. And then Jeremiah 51 talks about that Babylon is destroyed and to never be inhabited again. Well, Jerusalem's going to be inhabited again, so I don't know how that fits, but you can answer that. And it'll be destroyed by a devastating wind. But wait a minute. That almost sounds supernatural, right? From God. But Revelation 17 makes it clear that it's through the 10 kings. It's through this one world system. You see that as basically being Rome. I see it as a future end times superpower. So I don't know how you would make all that fit in 70 AD. How is this city destroyed in 1 hour? And then after its destruction, it's never to be inhabited again. Go ahead, take your time.
Yeah, no, you're good. So there's a couple things that we can look at. First of all, though, I don't. You said that like these, like there's a G7. So let's say there's a G10, right? Let's say they include 3 other nations, and you're like, well, these people would be giving up their sovereignty, but according to Revelation 17:12, they have no sovereignty to give up
Right.
because they have not yet received a kingdom. So that's why I say it's God is trying to use language in a and like a hyperbole apocalyptic way that a first century audience would understand, to say, oh, this is talking about like people that must be really important. And we know that those would be the generals that led those 10 provinces that Rome controlled. That's why when we get to verse 16 of Revelation 17, it says, and the 10 horns and the beast. So now we've got 10 horns and a beast. So there's 11 parties total here. That says that you saw will hate the prostitute. They will leave her desolate and naked. That's
Right.
apocalyptic language. And will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Apocalyptic language. Eating her flesh is talking about killing the inhabitants of the city. Burning her with fire was what happened. The entire city got destroyed with fire. And then, of course, yes, God did put into their hearts to carry out his purpose by uniting to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Now, when we're looking at how the provinces operated under Roman authority, Rome was very plug and play with their jurisdictions. So like they kind of let like the people in the provinces they inhabited still kind of do their thing. They were allowed to still follow their cultural customs. That wasn't how like governments usually operated. And when we're looking at like historically speaking, when a foreign army would come in and take over another nation, they would literally like instill their own beliefs on that nation. The cultural identity would get wiped. That's not what happened with Rome. Rome let the cultural identity of the places that they inhabited or that they conquered kind of stay intact, and that's why we get the 10 toes of Daniel's statue when God says, yeah, so like the mire will not, or the clay will not mix with the iron. It's talking about because Rome allowed these cultural identities to remain. That's what caused these uprisings when there was these rebellions popping up all through the Roman Empire in the first century AD, because the people were sick of having Rome kind of like be a looming presence in their kingdoms, I guess you could say, or their places that these cultural identities were operating. So like it all kind of comes full circle, but that's why God has to specify. God puts it into their hearts to carry out his purpose, because when we're looking at how this would have operated, it's very possible that if Vespasian were to go to one of these 10 provinces that he was over, and said, hey, come on, round up your conscripts, we got to go to Jerusalem. They could have been like, nah, dude, we can't do that, we've got way too much stuff here to worry about, we've got these rebellions popping up all over the place. But because God was like, no, like the judgment has come, it's time, these other 10 provinces, they didn't bat an eye. They're like, yep, let's go, it's time to rock and roll.
But remember, well, there's a few things I want to address, and I appreciate it. So how the chronology works of Revelation, we've agreed that there's recapitulation.
Correct.
I've pointed out how you can split Revelation right down the middle and you get two-part chronology. Now you've got Antichrist continuing in power for 42 months, and this is, I would argue, at the midpoint of this 7-year period. I mean, all throughout Revelation, you have very specific days mentioned: 1260, 1290, 42 months in Daniel, times and half a time, 1335. And so these are all smaller periods of time than 7 years, but none of them surpass 7 years. So I would argue that they are segments of a 7-year period. And it is not until your fourth seal that you have death in one quarter of the earth. Fifth seal, you have martyrs appearing in heaven. So this is where I would say the ripple effect of the first seal, where you have a man, I would argue it's Antichrist, going forth to conquer, because he's on a white horse, because Jesus comes on a white horse in Revelation 19, but he's a counterfeit Jesus. Okay. And so the natural result of a shift in power like this is oftentimes world war. This is what we've seen with World War I. And as a matter of fact, what happened because of World War I? What rose? Well, League of Nations. And then World War II, you had the United Nations, the embryonic world government, which is situated in the United States of America. We basically run it in many ways. And so World War III, I think it was Einstein that said, if there is a World War IV, it'll be fought with sticks and stones, because World War III will be so catastrophic. It'll be so disastrous and devastating that we'll basically be back to a Stone Age. And so at the fifth seal is where I argue that this one world system would come full circle. Okay, so by that point, you've had the world at war, and it'll be so devastating that your world powers of today that we could speak to, they'll be wiped out. And out of that world war, you'll have a man who rises, who makes claims of peace, just like Antiochus Epiphanes, but he works deceitfully. And so he gets full power. And wherever he is a leader of, whatever country he's a leader of, let's say he's a major leader of America during this World War III. Well, you could have these 10 kings not being separate kings from separate nations, but 10 kings or generals or senators, politicians within that nation that actually go with the Antichrist and act as his leading right-hand men during the reign of this one world global system. So, you could interpret it that way rather than a G10 summit. But my follow-up question to what you said, because I think you made some good points, and so it brings this question to mind. And right in the verse here, I've got a full screen so the audience can see the text better.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but before I ask you this question, I want to go back to here, because we've mentioned so many topics. I don't want us to forget to engage this. So Revelation 16, I was saying this near the beginning, and the great city was divided into three parts. I think we both agreed that was Jerusalem. And so we have three judgments here. And the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God. And so I see this plainly as making a distinction between Jerusalem, your cities of the nation, and then great Babylon. So by definition, at least the most parsimonious explanation of exegeting this passage would be that great Babylon is a different city than Jerusalem. And I would argue the strongest position against Jerusalem is the fact that we have all of these different scriptures that corroborate this conclusion. Again, Revelation 11, Jerusalem is called spiritually Sodom and Egypt. Here in Revelation 16, we have three separate judgments, one on Jerusalem, one on the cities of the nations, and then one on Babylon. So we see that distinction there. Thirdly, and I'm glad you engaged it, I do appreciate it, but I'm not sure it's very consistent with the law of parsimony, that you have the Antichrist and his armies that essentially have invaded Jerusalem. And for 42 months, they are going to tread underfoot Jerusalem. So for 3.5 years, that's where this leader, this figure, I would argue is the Antichrist, he's in power for 42 months from Jerusalem. So why in the world is he nuking himself? Why is he destroying? You made the case, maybe he's in a bunker or something like that, right. And I appreciate you engaging it. I just don't know if it's a very convincing response. And so why don't we stick with Revelation 16? Because I think when it comes to differentiating lines of evidence, if we find a verse like this, okay, because a lot of what we're talking about is agnostic, like Revelation 17 with the 10 kings. And when it comes to 5 have fallen, one is to come. Okay, I interpret that. Again, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Grecia. The one that is Rome, and the one to come is your New World Order. And I think you'd have to be living under a rock I've seen many full preterists admit, yeah, we're obviously heading into a one world government. They just don't think it has anything to do with prophecy. And I would say, no, it does have to do with prophecy. That's the one world kingdom that is to come. And so notice how it fits. But then what you said with the Roman leaders and the Caesars, okay, that fits too. In hindsight, you've been able to make it fit. And so we both have an explanation. So to me, that makes it agnostic. We can both explain it in many ways. But a verse like this, I really, really, really am curious how you interpret these three separate judgments in light of the position that says Babylon and Jerusalem are basically one and the same. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I do want to. I'll go to Revelation 16 real quick though. I do want to go back to Revelation 6 because he said the fifth seal is when we see martyrs in heaven. But you don't see martyrs in heaven, because what happens is the Lamb opens the fifth seal, and I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony they had upheld. And they cried out in a loud voice, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you avenge our blood and judge those who dwell upon the earth or the land?" Then each of them was given a white robe and told to rest a little while longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers, were killed just as they had been killed. So, interesting thing here, this is talking about the vindication of the martyrs. The vindication of the martyrs had not happened yet. They were told to rest just a little while longer because it was coming. So, but also it's interesting the way that the Bible kind of uses terminology or phrases. It's the souls of those, not the spirits of those. The spirit is what goes back to the Father. The soul is what is earthly. That's what our body is comprised of, I guess I would say. So when we're looking at this isn't talking about their spirits are
a
up in heaven.
clarifying question.
Yes.
Is sometimes in the Bible spirit and soul used interchangeably?
I don't believe so, because Scripture says that the Word of God can cleave the soul and spirit. It divides the soul and spirit.
I do agree with you that man is made up of body, soul, spirit.
Yeah.
When we're born again, when we trust Christ for salvation, our spirits are quickened. We're passed from death into life. We're taken from unregeneration to regeneration.
Yeah.
Now, the soul, like, for example, if you see in the news, 5 souls saved from a boat accident or a plane crash or something like that. That's not talking about their spirit that would either go to heaven or hell. Correct. It's talking about the being. And so, yeah, the soul can be referring to the being, right? Your being, my being. I'm a living soul. But then within that living being, we also have a spirit.
Correct.
We also have flesh. And so here, I think context would say, and I do appreciate you pointing out, that's a good point. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them. So basically their being at that time.
Right. The way that
it's under the altar in heaven, their soul. That's where they are. These beings are under, this altar right here. Are you saying that's on earth or?
Yeah. I would argue actually that it's talking whenever it's talking about the altar and it's talking about like the one that was in the second temple. Correct.
Okay, so under the souls of them that were slain.
Correct.
So the being, because I would argue that yes, at this point we're not glorified, and so these martyrs, they are in heaven, but they're not with their flesh. It's just their regenerated spirit. But in that context, that is their soul. And what I mean is that's their being. Right now, our being is body, soul, spirit. We're a living soul. In heaven, without our flesh, right? This unregenerate flesh here, it's not inheriting the kingdom of God. It would just stink up the place. And so what's in heaven before glorification, before we get new bodies? Well, our regenerated spirit. And in that context, that would be our being, basically. But I would argue, so it says that we're slain for the word of God. So it sounds like these souls were killed, and now they're saying, Lord, how much longer until you judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth, because God's wrath has not yet been poured out on the unbelieving world.
And this is what we're going to move into. I do want to get into the blood motif, because once we kind of develop this blood motif, we can kind of solidify who Babylon is. But I'll go to Revelation. I do want to go to Revelation 16 for you.
Okay.
So you're saying that you're like, okay, the city was split into three parts. This has to be three separate judgments. What I would say is this: the splitting of the great city, which is Jerusalem, into three parts, it's actually echoing what happens in Ezekiel when God tells Ezekiel, shave your head and put it into three different bundles. And it's three different, like it's representing three different things, but it happened to the same city.
Okay, so you're saying, and this is kind of how if I'm understanding you correctly, because when I read this, I felt the plain reading of the text was that we have three different separate judgments on three separate entities. Jerusalem, the entity that is the cities of the nations,
right?
And then your third entity, Babylon. But I thought, how would the full preterist who interprets Mystery Babylon as being Jerusalem, how would they interpret this? I wanted to see if I could, figure it out. And so I thought you would say, or somebody would say, okay, we have the great city, which is Jerusalem, divided into three parts, and comprising the great city that is now divided into three parts is the cities of the nations and Great Babylon. And so basically it's all Jerusalem. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, but and that's what I concocted in terms of, and I mean this in the most respectful way, a rescue device. How would I rescue the Babylon in Jerusalem as one in the same theory? And that's what I thought. Okay, this is probably how they'd answer it. But I don't know if that's consistent with the law of parsimony, because rather it seems like, no, you got a great city. It's divided into three parts, one city. But how do we now have the cities of the nations? This seems like it's totally separate than what Jerusalem has been divided into.
Yeah. So let me just kind of say, so Ezekiel 5. Yep. Ezekiel 5. Okay. Verse 1. As for you, son of man, take a sharp sword, use it as a barber's razor, and shave your head and beard. Then take a set of scales and divide the hair. Verse 2. When the days of the siege have ended, you are to burn up a third of the hair inside the city. So you've got 1/3. You are to also take a third of the hair and slash it with the sword all around the city. There's your second third. And you are to scatter a third to the wind. So when I look at this and I see the city being divided into three parts, I'm seeing John hearkening back to Ezekiel, talking about judgment that was upon Jerusalem, because that's what Ezekiel's about. The first half of Ezekiel is about Jerusalem. So when I see this, okay, the great city was divided into three parts. Well, that's because a third of them were burned inside the city, a third of them were slashed with the sword, and the other third were scattered to the wind, which, like, history would tell us happened because after the siege of Jerusalem, the Roman Empire went through and they gathered up the Jews and they sent them on a ship back to Africa to be sold into slavery.
Okay. So, let me ask you this then.
Yep.
We have one city, that great city, divided into three parts.
Yep.
And the cities of the nations fell. So we
Correct.
have plural cities.
Correct.
Plural nations.
Yep.
But you are making those two things.
No, so I agree
aspects of Jerusalem.
No, I agree that the cities of the nations is absolutely talking about something separate, because this is talking about when the judgment had come upon old covenantal Jerusalem. We now have the new covenant, and this like cities of the nations collapsing, it's apocalyptic language to say the kingdom of Christ was delivered, right? Because that's what like 1 Corinthians 15 is all about. There's, you know what I mean, when he had put all authority and power and et cetera under his feet. So these cities of the nations collapsing is talking about the deliverance of the kingdom, the showing up of the kingdom from Christ to God, which is symbolic because Christ is God. To say, okay, this is the deliverance of the kingdom, and that's what we do see in Revelation when it says the kingdoms of the earth
are become the kingdom.
Yes, correct. Yes, and that's the. Go ahead.
So I appreciate that. So then, in light of your exegesis of that, do you find it problematic that, and I have a slide here, do you find it problematic that the destruction of Babylon is described in a way that suggests Babylon will never be inhabited again. Jeremiah 51, firstly, and then also Revelation 18. But if Jerusalem, okay, go ahead. You're going to talk. Go ahead.
No, you're all right. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so if Jerusalem is end times mystery Babylon, and you say end times was in 70 AD, how can you say it's never going to be inhabited again? Because it was inhabited again. As a matter of fact, according to the Futurist, if a Futurist holds to Babylon being Jerusalem, in that same month, Jesus Christ is going to rule and reign from Jerusalem, and us in a glorified state are going to reign with them. Right. So how in the world can you rightfully say that it's never going to be inhabited again? But if it's Antichrist ruling and reigning from Jerusalem with his armies, and it's put into their heart to destroy Babylon, okay, across the ocean, basically, this city, and then it's destroyed. And they even say, the merchants say, and I'll pull it up here, and then I'll give you enough time to respond, but for the audience sake, I want them to see this. Yeah. And the merchants say, so the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And so here's the plagues, judgment upon her. They've glorified herself, lived deliciously. And what do they say when judgment comes in 1 hour? Well, the merchants of the earth, it seems to imply the merchants of the earth don't necessarily love Babylon, but they love the fact that Babylon is buying their merchandise. And so they say, they're crying, and they're like, for no man buyeth their merchandise anymore. The merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and fine linen and ointments and wine and oil and all these kinds of things, right? And so Jerusalem, as far as I know, they're not this massive consumer of merchandise. But what nation today buys up merchandise from everywhere? I mean, how much merchandise comes from China alone a day to the United States? You can go drive. I'm in Canada, but you can drive up, if you're in Phoenix or something, I think you can go to the ocean side and basically see just massive boats, boat after boat after boat, bringing in just incredible amounts of merchandise. And so it kind of makes, and notice Hollywood, right? All the movies are coming out of the States, music's coming out of this, everything's coming out of the States. And so it makes sense that the world, because I'm arguing that the spirit of Babylon resides in whatever the world power of the day is. And so at the time of Christ, it was Rome. In the Dark Ages, it was the Roman Catholic Church, I would argue. Today, I mean, it's the United States. When's the last time they've been invaded? The War of 1812, when Britain came in and basically lit or sieged the White House, and they had to have all these evacuations. But since then, I mean, no, I mean, it's America that says we will see no sorrow. No one will mess with us. And now, if the end times is not for another 500 years, then I would argue that, yeah, geographically, spirit of Babylon could move. But the question I have is, where is the spirit of Babylon today? Anyways, I said a lot there. How do you interpret all of that in light of your position that Babylon and Jerusalem are one and the same? And start with this: it'll never be inhabited again. How do you see that?
So let's go to Jeremiah 33, and we'll do verses 10 through 11. You can bring it up.
Are you sharing screen? Oh, I can bring it up.
Yeah, if you want to bring it up, that's fine. I don't care.
So Jeremiah 33.
Yep, verses 10 and 11. Okay, so says, this is what the Lord says: in this place that you say is a wasteland, without man or beast, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem that are deserted, inhabited by neither man nor beast, there will be heard again the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of the bride and bridegroom, and the voices of those bringing thank offerings into the house of the Lord, saying, give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good, his loving devotion endures forever. For I will restore the land from captivity as in former times, says the Lord. So we have in Jeremiah 33, 10 and 11, an inverse of that, right? It's like, hey, there's going to be these things heard again. But when we get to Revelation 18, verses 21 and through 24, here's what we get. Says, then a mighty angel picked up a stone the size of a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, with such violence the great city of Babylon will be cast down, never to be seen again, and the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will never ring out in you again, nor will any craftsman of any trade be found in you again, nor the sound of a millstone be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again, and the voices of a bride and bridegroom will never call out in you again, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. Then there was found in her the blood of the prophets and saints, and of all who had been slain on the land. Now, we've got two contrasts here. Revelation 18 is dealing with an old covenantal system of worship, though. So when this old covenantal system of worship gets destroyed, it's saying that it's never going to be inhabited again, in the sense that the old covenantal system of worship is never going to have any kind of bearing on the society of these people. So like if we go to Jerusalem today, yes, of course it's still standing. We go there, and yes, of course there's still people that are like denying Christ ever came. A lot of people in Jerusalem are actually atheists these days, but the people that are like the Orthodox or Hasidic Jews or whatever, they're obviously staying to their old covenantal like things, but it doesn't matter. That's why it's saying never again will you be inhabited. God is saying like the way that you're trying to operate through an old covenantal system of worship does not matter. But Jeremiah 33, 10 through 11 is saying, oh, this is the complete opposite. There's going to be all this great stuff, and the bride and the bridegroom are going to sound out, because it's talking about the new covenant. This is so you see how you have this contrast with it, and you can see that Jeremiah is talking about the new covenant, Revelation is talking about the old covenant. So it's not that Jerusalem would literally never be inhabited again. It's just that the old covenantal system of worship, the way that they operated by, would have no bearing. That's why I said earlier that it's important to denote that I believe that mystery Babylon is old covenantal Jerusalem, not just Jerusalem as a whole.
And you don't think, and I do appreciate your points there, you don't think that explanation is over spiritualizing or over allegorizing what Revelation 18 is describing?
I don't believe so. No, I mean, I definitely get where you're coming from, where you're like, hey, like these people were talking about like, the things that they were able to buy. Now, if you look in the Old Testament, Jerusalem is noted as having all these things inside of it, right? The fine linen, the purple silk, and the scarlet silk, which obviously purple and scarlet were the colors.
Were all the nations at that time, were they buying up merchandise from Jerusalem in a similar way to how today we've got all the different countries selling their merchandise to a country like the States, let's say?
I mean, on a obviously not on a global
Right,
scale,
it'd be more of a local.
but on a local scale,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. Like, I mean, that's what that's what Israel was known for. All throughout Chronicles and Kings, you see the exploits of King Solomon and how he was like getting all this gold and making all these trades. So I do believe that like what we're looking at here in Revelation 18:9 and following is God describing the former glory of the old covenantal Israel going away. He's telling his people, hey, the glory days, all this great stuff, when they had that, what did they do, Donnie? They went to pagan gods. They were worshiping pagan gods while God's giving them all these great, all this abundance of wealth and all these fine scents of oils and myrrh and stuff. And they're like, yeah, cool, thanks God. I'm going to go ahead and worship Baal now, or I'm going to go ahead and do what these Assyrians are doing or these Canaanites are doing. And so like he's saying that your former glory is going to be gone. Now, I do want to.
If I could ask you this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you say of Jerusalem, I sit a queen and am no widow and shall see no sorrow? Because all throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, of course, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was constantly being attacked by the surrounding nations.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelites were constantly being taken captive. And as a matter of fact, in 2nd century BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes made a league or a covenant or a treaty with the apostate Jews, a major reason for the apostate Jews at that time being willing to bow down to the Hellenistic religion of Antiochus Epiphanes was essentially because they were sick and tired of constantly being judged and being attacked and persecuted by other nations. They really did think that they were cursed. And so they thought, you know what? If we make a covenant with the Gentiles, specifically Antiochus Epiphanes, then maybe we can be safe from persecution and war for once. And so I don't see how Jerusalem would ever say, I sit as a queen and I see no sorrow. It's like they're always seeing sorrow. So in your opinion, could Jerusalem say such a thing?
Absolutely, because old covenantal Israel, well, I guess just if we're looking biblically, we're going to talk about Israel, right? Bloodline Israelites. They were hard-headed. God said you will be a stiff-necked, hard-headed people, and they could easily take all of the tribulation that they had been through before and wear that as a badge of honor. I mean, if we look at a good example of that is in Daniel 9, when Daniel is doing a prayer for his people, he literally says in verse let's look at this here. In verse Daniel 9.
Did you want to share screen?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I want to, because this is really important language that he uses here. But he says in we have not listened to servants, prophets, shame, never. He says like never before has this been done. Daniel here we 9? Go. Yes. So sorry. Daniel 9 verse 12. So let's look at what Daniel says here in verse 12. He says, "You have carried out the words spoken against us and against our rulers by bringing upon us a great disaster. For under all of heaven, nothing has ever been done like what has been done to Jerusalem." So Daniel is identifying. I mean, we could read the whole chapter, but he's saying it's because we are hard-headed, stiff-necked people. We were transgressing your covenant. We were turning away from you, right? We were doing all these things we shouldn't have done. That you did something that has never been done, like what has been done to Jerusalem. So the Jews of old covenantal Israel, yes, they absolutely would wear these trials and tribulations as a way that they're like, well, we've been through so much, but look what our God has delivered us from. Look at what, like, we're still standing. So yes,
yeah, but it's hard to believe that they could say we see no sorrow. Yeah, they see the deliverance, they see the brighter side, right?
But they were
night
blinded,
is darkest
though,
just
Donny.
before the dawn.
But they were blinded. That's what God said he would do in Isaiah. He'd give them eyes to not see and ears to not hear.
Well, clearly not all of them, because you had the apostate Jews at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes who were like, yeah, let's go make a covenant with the Gentiles because we would rather serve the Hellenistic gods and religion than have to face another day of persecution at the hands of surrounding nations. Go ahead.
But look at how Israel, like, let's go forward to the 1st century AD at the time of Christ. Look at how Israel was buddy partnered up with Rome. They were absolutely riding on the coattails of Rome as a corporate body, and that alone would be like a great offense to God. He's like, what, you're buddying up with these pagans? Like, but obviously it was all according to his will.
It seemed like it was more of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing, where, okay, let's buddy up with Rome in order to benefit from that friendship. But deep down inside, they saw Rome as the enemy.
Well, maybe. I mean, that could be, but we know that the Sanhedrin, the governing body of the spiritual side of Israel at that point, because yes, Rome had governmental authority over Israel, but like every interaction that we see with Christ is really with the Sanhedrin and the scribes and the Pharisees. Yes, obviously he did have an interaction with with Rome in the sense of he got brought before Pontius Pilate, and even Pontius Pilate was like, bro, I don't see anything wrong with this guy. Y'all, what are you all talking about? Do you want to free him or the murderer? Which one?
Right.
And they're like,
Right.
oh yeah, let's free the murderer, the guy that like is according to the 10 Commandments lost. He's a lost soul. He killed somebody. You know what I mean?
Right.
But so the fact that the Jews were like, yeah, no, give us this guy. Go ahead and in Rome, you can enact judgment on our behalf and on Christ because this guy's claiming he's God. So yeah, this was all a huge culmination. I absolutely believe that in Israel's heart, they'd be like, yeah, we sit as a queen. They're like, we're good. We're buddy with Rome. Yeah, we're good. They love us. But what happened?
Okay,
Rome
so you're
turned
saying,
around
yeah,
and attacked them.
right. So that they were caught off guard in 70 AD, you're saying, because they had this attitude and mentality that we sit as a queen, we are friends and on good terms with Rome. We're not going to see, sorrow, because who would mess with Rome? If they mess with Rome, they're also messing with us. And then bam, God's judgment came in 70 AD because Commander Titus and his Roman legions came into Jerusalem.
Yep.
Destroyed the temple, destroyed the city. And okay, I understand your position and what you're saying on
and
that.
even on that point though, you have Christ who is like obviously performing these great miracles, speaking with the corporate body Israel face to face, and they're still not believing anything. They're still like, yeah, no, we know better than you. And Christ is like, really? That's funny. Like, I mean, we see all throughout the Gospel of John, all of the feast days of Israel and stuff like that. Like Christ is like, oh yeah, this is the Feast of Lights. I am the light. Like he's showing so much authority, and like they were blind. They this is just to fulfill what God had, just the same way that God puts in the heart that God had put in the hearts of the beast and the 10 kings to fulfill what he wanted to fulfill. God put the blindness and the deafness on old covenantal Israel to fulfill, to get his telos, his ultimate goal, his accomplishment, which was a new covenant where it's not just bloodline Israel and maybe some proselytes that were like following the right things, right? No, it's available to everybody now. But
okay, let me ask you what I want to say, and I appreciate those points. Yeah. I believe since we're pre-recording to make it a premiere, yeah, the recording maxes out at 2 hours. And since I think we're doing good though, I think we've got 11 minutes to 2 hours. So let me ask you, because we were talking about God's wrath, the Trumpets Vials earlier, and you attributed them more so to symbolism, imagery, not necessarily literal and physical like the plagues of Exodus. Now, I also did want us to engage Daniel 12, but man, time has flown by, and since we're almost at 2 hours, let's save that for our second episode, because I know you had some questions on Daniel 12, and I really wanted to engage those. And this has been a ton of fun. At the end of the day, I think 2 hours is minimum when engaging Babylon. So we'll save the Daniel one for next one, and I really want to engage that. But I would be curious, and maybe we'll wrap it up with this. I think this has been a lot of fun. Revelation 7. And so notice we have, after these things, Revelation 6, which is what I would argue is the analog to Luke 21, Mark 13, Matthew 24, where we've had local judgment. We've had a local fulfillment in 70 AD. And then because the world works in cycles, God works in very specific patterns. There's nothing new under the sun. Wicked men try and take over the planet, Pinky and Brain style, in much the same ways.
All right.
And I think that's why we see the dragon working through Antiochus Epiphanes pre-cross. It talks about how Antiochus Epiphanes, his power is mighty, but not of his own. And then we see the beast in Revelation 13. His power is mighty, but he is given power. He is given authority through the dragon, the serpent, that devil, or the old serpent, the devil. And so wicked men are being influenced demonically, I would say, because we understand, the devil wants to be like the Most High. Anyway, so wicked men under the influence of dark powers are trying to rule the world in many of the same ways. And so I do believe it'll culminate with what I think clearly the world is heading into right now, a one world government where the Antichrist basically his main base of operations will be in Jerusalem. And now everything is set for what happened in 70 AD to basically happen again, except now there's going to be global ramifications rather than in 70 AD, there were more so local ramifications. But after Revelation 6, we have the start of what I would say is God's wrath. And that's why, since I hold to a sixth seal rapture, we have the sixth seal, sun and moon go dark, so on and so forth. Great multitude appear in heaven, came out of great tribulation in Revelation 7. But before the trumpets and vials are poured out, and this is what I'd be curious for you to comment on. Notice this. And after these things, I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth. And the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And mind you, this is after the famine, the starvation, the inflation, the pestilence, all of that, that I would argue is the devil's wrath in Revelation 6. So this is after that. And so now it says, and I was quoting this earlier, but here's the actual passage in front of you. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. So it sounds like a literal physical hurting of the earth and the sea. But here's where I want to focus on. Saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And then we have the 144,000 sealed. And once they're sealed, Revelation 8 starts. He opens the seventh seal. There's silence in heaven about the space of half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Which means men are raptured first. I think is how the joke goes. And I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. Okay, so we have seals and then trumpets. Because a lot of people, they say, oh, the seals and the trumpets and the vials, they happen concurrently. Well, no, because the seals are over. We have the seventh seal. The seven seals open. And now the angels are given seven trumpets. And notice this. The first angel sounded. And there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass burnt up. So what is my point here? My point here is the language seems so clear in saying that this is literal, physical. This is the literal and physical hurting of the earth through the hail and fire. I mean, it's saying third part of the trees was burnt up. And I feel like if this was more allegorical or symbolic, then why in the world did the angel say, wait a minute, don't sound the first trumpet. We don't want hail and fire being cast on the earth yet, because the servants of our God are not sealed. So if they're not sealed, they're going to be hurt. They're going to be killed. And then once they're sealed, boom, the first angel sounds. And as a result of hail and fire mingled with blood, they're cast upon the earth. A third part of the trees was burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. So my basic question is, how do you allegorize and spiritualize or symbolize what we're reading here? Because it really does seem to indicate, the chronology at least, that this is literal physical pain on the earth.
Well, so when I'm looking at Revelation 7, I think that it's also important to note that, like, the timing of, like, these things happening doesn't really necessarily have to mean it's like, you know, a long period of time apart from one another. So when we're looking at, like, the sixth seal, right? Okay, cool, you got the sixth seal. Then before the seventh seal is, undone, you've got the sealing. It doesn't mean that, like, it's like a super long length of time between the sixth and the seventh seal, though, because these seals and everything that's being described with the trumpets and the bowls of wrath is describing a type of judgment that was coming upon a localized area. So when it's like, okay, yeah, don't do anything until we've sealed the foreheads of the servants of our God, but then they're sealed. right? Because then like okay, here's the number of all of them that were sealed, and then in verse 9, he looked and they saw it like this is the culmination when you see the multitude too large to count from every nation and tribe and people and tongue standing before the throne before the Lamb, and they're holding white robes and the palm branches. This is the wedding. This is the messianic wedding. This is how also how the Feast of Tabernacles was celebrated. People would go out and get palm branches, and same thing when it's like signifying when Christ was coming in at the triumphal entry, and they were saying Hosanna, and they got palm branches. So we see that this is imagery of something, um, like a culmination of things. And again, I would say that like it's kind of hard to look at Revelation, right, and be like, okay, well, how come in the middle of chapter 7 it's talking about this? But you and I both agree the original texts weren't necessarily broken out into or into chapters and verses.
Right. Those
It
aren't
is
inspired.
right. So it is good for our ability to be able to be like, hey, look at this verse right here in this chapter of this book, and we can go there. But I think that we need to also just like kind of follow the narrative, and we know that this has to be a culmination of things in chapter 7, because it even says these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Well, what do you wash your robes in? That's in Revelation 22 verse 14. The blessed are those who wash their robes so that they may have the right to enter, may have the right to the tree of life, and may enter the city by its gates. The city is New Jerusalem. New Jerusalem is the new heaven and earth, because the new heaven and earth is brought down as a bride. So now you have the marriage, and it goes right back to what we were just looking at in chapter 7, where they're holding palm branches to signify a marriage. So this is all very closely intertwined, and it goes together. And it's too bad that we're out of time, because I mean, I really want to build on this blood motif that we see in Revelation. It's very important to identify Mystery Babylon. So
yeah, I do have a few things I want to say to that, but since we're just a minute and a half away from the 2-hour mark,
yeah,
I appreciate your response there. I think this has been really good, and we can continue this discussion basically ASAP, sometime maybe this week, because there's a few things in Daniel that I want to talk about, a few things in Daniel 12 I really want to talk about. And so, yeah, since we're about to hit the 2-hour mark, I appreciate you doing this, Professing Preterist.
of course.
I'll wrap it up here, and so we can premiere this for the audience. I think this has been an excellent discussion. We've talked about a lot of points. We've engaged a lot of interesting topics. And all I got to say to the audience is stay tuned, because Professing Preterist and we're going to get together, and we are going to continue discussing all things end times theology. And so with that, God bless all. Standing for Truth is out.